there, Jim. So we're going to go on to the completion of the oral interview now. So Jim, can you please give us a short description of your qualifications for office?
I've been in public service since I graduated from law school in 1980. I began with legal services. I was a legal aid attorney in Santa Barbara County, then shortly thereafter became director of Legal Aid Foundation of Santa Barbara County, then became director, managing attorney of Legal Services of Northern California in Sacramento. During that time, I did civil rights cases. I represented victims of employment discrimination and housing discrimination. I handled domestic violence cases. I handled public benefits cases, obtaining benefits for people either unjustly denied or who had a theory as to why they should get benefits and were denied. A whole host of legal issues on behalf of low-income people. I also helped in community organizing over rent control type issues, and really learned what it is like for low-income people to try to exist in our society, and some of the pitfalls that they are up against. So I feel intimately familiar with social service issues and access issues for low-income people. I went from there from legal services to working for the Senate Judiciary Committee as their counsel for 3 years. I worked under Senator Bill Lockyer. While I was there, I volunteered to write and staff the hate crime law, which is our current hate crime law in California. It was enacted, co-sponsored by then Lieutenant Governor Leo McCarthy. I worked on what was really a predecessor to the realignment that we have now. I staffed Senate Bill 25 legislation that would have established early release and community programs such as drug treatment and job training for people getting out of prison, and also let the low-level offenders be treated locally rather than go to state prison. That was vetoed by Governor Duke Mason, but eventually became one of the models for what we now have in terms of community corrections. I went from there to Chief Counsel at Assembly Public Safety Committee under then Assembly Member John Burton. Worked for him for a little over a year. I then went to the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office, where I became their legislative representative now for about 18 years. During that time, I've again had the opportunity to work on hate crime legislation, on numerous bills affecting rights of domestic violence victims and rights of children in child abuse cases. I've handled probably 60 or 70 environmental enforcement bills where we were seeking to beef up enforcement of environmental regulations, particularly those where there's a criminal violation of environmental laws. I've also worked on consumer issues, fighting efforts to weaken consumer protections and proposing new laws that provide greater protection for consumers, and then also on community corrections type issues. I guess it was now about 9 years ago, I was elected to the Davis School Board. I served there for one term, completing out my term as president of the school board. I was a strong advocate for English learner programs and for programs to help children who needed special assistance. The special ed program and other efforts were priorities of mine. I moved on to the Board of Supervisors, and I'm just finishing my first term as a member of the supervisors. I'm currently chair of the board.
Okay, so
Since you brought up your background on education, can you tell me in terms of your tenure on the school board in Davis, what your position was on the private testing of GATE students?
I know that came up, and I think I voted against it when it came up. I'd have to go back because it came up a few times, but generally I favored the school system determining who should get into the GATE program.
Well, it was sponsored by the school system in terms of its policy and allowing students to be privately tested by parents and then submitting those scores regardless of the number of times that students had to take the test to get to 95%. Can you verify your voting record on that issue?
I would have to go back, it's quite some time ago, but I don't favor that type of approach. I think the last vote I took on gate, I think it was Marty West brought a motion to tighten the gate testing standards because the number in the gate program had gone so high, and I voted with her on that resolution.
24% is 3 times the state and national average.
Right,
Yeah.
and she put forward a motion to tighten the standards to get into the gate program.
Because your background has been in the legal system and focused on equity and hate crimes, then I would assume, and you can elaborate on this if you would, that you saw an unjust process there since 100% of students who were white and were part of that program, or part of the private testing of students entered the program, whereas 0 African Americans and 2 Latinos, I believe, entered the program through private testing.
Well, and the problem with that is that if you can afford a test and continue to be retesting, they're going to have much greater chance of getting in, and if you're low income, you're not going to be able to hire the person to begin with, even for one retest.
So you would agree that it was not an equitable process, but supported bias in the education system?
Yeah, I don't agree with that process of private
Okay.
testing.
Thank you. Okay, the next question is, budget cuts have eroded many of the services that people in the community have come to rely on, leaving an increasing number of people vulnerable. How will you work to ensure the safety net of social programs is not decimated by public budget cuts?
Well, and we've been up against that situation, unfortunately, every single year, and we thought this would be a better year, and it's turning out not to be as much better. But some of the things that we've been doing is trying to look at places that aren't the programs for the poor and disabled, and do some consolidation there. 2 years ago, we consolidated the Parks Department into the CAO's office and eliminated much of the administrative overhead, which freed up money for other parts of our budget. We have also, when we've had administrators leave, have combined positions to again get savings so that we can spend in those other areas. I have also asked for the restoration of, we had a special fund that could be used on medical care and social services that went away a couple years ago, and I've asked our administrators to figure out a way to get that back. It's the money from the tobacco tax, so that the board will have funds at the end of the day to distribute to some of the into some of the gaps. The other thing I've done is try to make use of volunteers and foundation grants in particular areas that are underserved. For example, we set up a family justice center using existing resources that had everyone pull their services to one location so that child abuse victims and victims of domestic violence would not have to travel all over town trying to get services. All the agencies contributed their services. Nobody charged extra for it. We obtained foundation grants to pay for it, and then a lot of volunteers active in the program. We're trying to do the same thing now with a senior program. It's the Healthy Aging Alliance. This is all volunteers. We've established a nonprofit to handle the work of the alliance. And what the alliance specifically does is lobbies, not political lobby necessarily, but advocates on behalf of senior issues, coordinates the gaps in services. We found many overlapping programs, and we use this agency to eliminate some of those overlaps and to get people to work together better. And we've also testified at the state successfully in some cases on legislation that affects elderly and disabled people, like the in-home support services and the adult day health care. One of the things that we can do is work to consolidate services and cooperate with other counties. We're talking to Solano County right now about possibly combining our administration of in-home support services to cut administrative costs so that we can have more money in services. We have looked at looked at working with cities and other counties and any other government agency where we think we can achieve economies of scale and deliver better services. Now, ultimately, we have to have revenue. And one of the things Yolo County needs to do is develop some sources of revenue. I think some a business that will deliver sales tax, some economic development that would deliver jobs. That's all part of the process in the longer term. Much of what we've done is short term, trying to get to the place where we can be healthier economically. Our county gets less of the sales tax than almost any other county, or I'm sorry, less of the property tax than almost any other county in the state. And that's one of the things we're working on in terms of advocacy at the state level to try to correct that.
And as you make these changes, so that you're coordinating administrative effort and cost, how does that impact the recipient? Is the consideration to keep the recipient, the effort seamless so that the recipient isn't confused and the burden of getting services from multiple offices falling on the recipient, therefore they fall through the cracks?
Well, that's always my first question, is
Yeah.
what is the effect on the recipient? And I need to make sure that there isn't an effect on the recipient. Like for in-home support services, we have an advisory committee. That advisory committee is run by Fran Smith, who's just excellent at working with the constituents. And I have my staff or me, when a big issue comes up, go to their meetings to find out how things are impacting at the ground level. And specifically, when we were talking about cuts, I always ask, I had the director of social services in who was actually agreeing to some cuts, and I asked, will these cuts affect your ability to affect child abuse victims? In other words, will we have what happened in Sacramento if we make this cut?
Mm-hmm.
She said no, and I went and visited, and she convinced me that they could sustain a particular cut. This last budget period, she came in and said, remember when you asked me that question a couple of years ago? Well, it's now to the point where it may threaten the safety of kids. And so my position is we make sure we're to the level that doesn't threaten the kids, even if we have to take it from another program or someplace else in the budget.